On May 2nd of 2018, along a very remote stretch of road between two dusty, tree-lined villages in a southwestern district of the eastern Indian state of Odisha, an old, worn-down SUV was traveling with a family of passengers who were making their way back home after attending a local wedding. It had been quite a long day, and the scenic view of the heavy, shadow-packed road was quite a sight, with just trees and silence stretching for miles. They had good company in each other, and the driver of their rented vehicle, a man named Prabhu Bhattara, was a warm, easygoing presence as well. Throughout the ride, they had been constantly talking, laughing, and sharing little stories from the wedding, while Prabhu had been equally involved, tossing in his own jokes and comments every now and then. But as the journey continued, the chatter mellowed down, and the mood settled into a calm, contented silence. When, almost past noon, they started approaching a stretch of road that ran alongside a steep, downward-sloping valley blanketed with a thick underbrush. While driving there, Prabhu pulled the car over to the edge of the road, telling the family he was going to take a quick break to relieve himself. He got out and walked a short distance past the bushes and disappeared briefly into the thick roadside cover. A couple of minutes later, after finishing up, he started making his way back to the vehicle, casually brushing leaves off his shirt, when something down in the valley caught his eye. Far below, through the undergrowth, he noticed a massive black figure thrashing its way up the slope. Prabhu immediately got interested and moved a bit closer, squinting through the branches. As the shape came into focus, he realized it was a sloth bear. Sloth bears are one of the most aggressive bear species in the world and native to India. They've been persecuted by locals for a long time, hunted, beaten, and caged to be trained for street dances and public exhibitions. That exploitation led to a steep decline in their population, eventually pushing them into the vulnerable category of threatened species. Thankfully, after the implementation of wildlife protection laws in 1972, sloth bears were granted protected status, meaning they could no longer be hunted, captured, or used as pets, and are meant to be left undisturbed in designated wildlife zones. But since many of these protected areas still sit close to human settlements, these bears continue to cross paths with people, and because of their naturally hostile temperament, combined with the years of abuse, they rarely show fear towards humans and can turn deadly if approached, especially when provoked or vulnerable, which in this case, the bear was. As Prabhu got a bit closer, he noticed the animal was injured and walking with an awkward, unsteady stance. While an injured bear would normally be even more dangerous to approach, Prabhu seemed to take the situation lightly, assuming the limping animal wouldn't pose much of a threat. And that's when he made the decision to take a selfie with it. Seeing him move down the slope to approach the bear, the family inside the car started to call out to him, warning him to come back and leave the animal alone. But Prabhu brushed off the warnings and kept walking, casually making his way to just a couple of feet from the animal, which had now come to a stop. Back in the car, the family, realizing their words weren't getting through, to record what they had probably assumed would be nothing more than a reckless stunt to laugh about later. Meanwhile, Prabhu too grabbed his phone. He moved in closer to the bear and turned his face toward the camera, with the animal just behind him, barely a hand's distance away. But before he could click the picture, the bear exploded into action. It pounced on him, slamming him to the ground, and sinked its claws and teeth into him. At first, Prabhu tried to fight back, scrambling to get up and push the bear off. But a few savage swipes from the heavy, hooked claws drained the fight right out of him. He collapsed under the weight of the attack, completely helpless in the grip of the animal, which now showed no signs of stopping. By that time, the family had been screaming from the car, yelling at the top of their lungs while recording the horror unfolding in front of them. A few minutes later, several locals appeared on the scene, all of them shouting, throwing rocks, and trying to drive the bear away. But no one dared to step close enough to save the man who had practically handed himself over for the sake of a photo. While humans stood there helpless, a stray dog appeared from the bushes nearby. Seeing the man being ripped apart, it pounced on the bear and delivered some nasty bites, which of course weren't nearly enough to stop the onslaught. Someone in the crowd called in the forest rangers, who did respond immediately, but their closest post was 6 miles from the site of the attack, and by the time they eventually got there, Prabhu had long been dead on the spot, with the bear still standing guard over his body, visibly agitated and on the edge. The forest rangers tranquilized the bear and retrieved Prabhu's lifeless, brutally mangled remains, which were later handed off to his relatives, along with a compensation to cover funeral costs, to which the locals, along with the family, came out in protest, saying it wasn't nearly enough for the life that was lost in such a horrific way. It's the early morning hours of Sunday, January 28th of 2018, and after what had been a lively weekend escape with his friends, 35-year-old Zaim Kosnan was riding back to his hometown, about an hour's ride southwest of the Malaysian capital. The night had been just what he needed, They laughed, ate, talked about everything and nothing. For someone who'd been stuck in a bad spot lately, with no job and money running low, just getting out like that meant more than he'd admit. It felt good to forget about things for a while. Now, with the cool dawn breeze brushing past his face and the sky still caught between night and morning, he finally felt clear-headed, maybe even a little hopeful, as he cruised along the empty road on his motorcycle. The world around him was quiet, just scattered trees, open road, and that peaceful hum of solitude that only comes when the rest of the world is still asleep. But then suddenly, something pulled him out of his thoughts. Just ahead, on a lonely, dimly lit patch of road, was a huge snake. In fact, the largest one in the world, a reticulated python. Zaim immediately slammed on the brakes of his vehicle to get a better look at the gigantic snake. It was around 12 feet long and weighed close to 80 kilograms, nearly half the size of a fully grown adult python, but still, it was a sight to behold. Zaim got off his vehicle and spent a few moments carefully observing the reptile from a safe distance, and while doing so, a bold and desperate plan sparked in his mind, one that might finally help ease his growing financial burden. He had captured a few snakes back in his village and had a rough idea of how to handle them, so he thought, why not try his luck again? If he could capture this python, maybe he could sell it and earn some good money. Judging by its size, he estimated he could make well over $1,000 in the local currency, more than enough to cover his basic expenses and get a few things running at home. As he weighed the idea, Zaim knew capturing such a massive reptile bare-handed wasn't going to be easy. He'd need some kind of tools, but that late in the night there were no shops open and no one nearby to ask for help. Luckily, his house wasn't too far off, and since the snake didn't seem to be moving much, he figured he could make it back before it slithered out of reach. Zaim jumped on his bike and sped through the empty roads, reaching home where his elder sister was still awake. In a rushed whisper, he told her what he was up to, grabbed a pair of gloves and a sickle, and headed straight back. Just in time, the python was still there. Now it was his turn to handle the snake. Carefully approaching the sluggish animal, Zaim grabbed the slippery reptile, and after a lot of maneuvering through its thick, muscular body, he managed to get a hold of his head and gain full control over the heavy creature. But almost immediately, he realized he now had to carry the giant snake all the way back home on his bike. Still unfazed and taking the challenge head on, he hopped onto his two-wheeler, gripping the snake's head firmly with one hand while handling the bike with the other, letting the rest of its massive body drape over his shoulders and around his waist. He fired up the engine and began riding carefully along the dim, quiet road. It was around 3 a.m., and after a while, he started spotting a bunch of people here and there. A few minutes into the ride, the reptile began to feel easier to manage. Zaim figured it would be a smooth trip back, he'd make it home, wait for morning, and head to the markets to sell the animal. But just as he was playing that thought through his head, he felt the snake, which had been hanging across his shoulders, had quietly started to coil around his neck and chest. Having secured its head, Zaim assumed the dangerous part was under control, not realizing this wasn't some ordinary snake he'd wrangled before. This was a python, a creature that didn't need fangs or venom to kill. It would crush a man with nothing but pressure. Still, thinking the grip wasn't too tight, Zaim kept going. But seconds later, the stealthy reptile suddenly constricted with brutal force, tightening its hold around his chest and neck. He lost control of both the bike and the python's head. He tumbled off the vehicle, with the snake still wrapped tightly around him, crashing hard into the asphalt, and with the impact, the already agitated reptile cinched its grip even tighter. For the next couple of minutes, Zaim fought like hell. He kicked, rolled, and tried prying the thick coils off with his bare hands, but the more he struggled, the harder it squeezed. His breathing got shorter, his strength started slipping, and everything around him began to blur, until his frantic, last-minute kick slowed and then stopped. A short while later, a few people showed up at the scene and found Zaim's lifeless body, with the stealthy reptile still coiled tightly around it. The group hurled stones and sticks at the snake and killed it right there, eventually managing to pull Zaim free. But by then, it was far too late. Zaim was pronounced dead on the spot. Ever since an American school teacher pulled off the first successful stunt at Niagara Falls back in 1901, going over in nothing but an oak barrel, the place has been a magnet for daredevils and thrill seekers from all over the world. Over the years, people have tried just about everything to conquer the falls. Some went jet skiing straight into the drop, others tried paragliding, kayaking, walking tightropes, or just flat out jumping off, risking everything for the rush of adrenaline, or more likely, a shot at fame and fortune. Out of the thousands who've attempted stunts at Niagara, only 16 ever made it out alive, and while the survivors usually get all the spotlight, it's the ones who didn't make it that often leave behind the most gripping stories, the ones that fall apart because of overlooked safety, small technical mistakes, or just the brutal nature of the falls itself. Of course, there are those accounts when all of these factors come together, and the outcome ends up being a disaster beyond imagination. On the early morning of July 11th, 1920, 58-year-old barber from England, Charles Stevens, stood in front of a massive crowd at the edge of the Horseshoe Falls with the intention of hurling himself over inside a barrel, unaware that despite 11 long years of planning and preparation for this single act, he had overlooked a simple but critical step, making a mistake he had been warned about more than once by his peers. Charles had spent most of his life on the streets of Bristol. Working as a barber, he barely paid the bills, and with 11 kids to feed, the math never worked in his favor. To make ends meet, he started performing small-time stunts on the side, high dives, makeshift shows, risky jumps, anything that drew a crowd and a few coins. It wasn't glamorous, and it definitely wasn't safe, but it was all he had. Thanks to his off-the-wall ideas and gutsy attitude, his name started going around, and people started calling him the Demon Barber of Bedminster. But even with the localized burst of attention, the payoff was next to nothing. The crowd showed up, but the money didn't. He even tried moving to a new city, hoping a change might turn things around, but between barber work and part-time stunts, he was still stuck in the same grind. Eventually, it occurred to him, if he was ever going to break out of this, he needed something bigger, something bold, perhaps a stunt so insane it couldn't be ignored. The idea came to him sometime around 1909. It had been nearly 8 years since a schoolteacher from the US had survived going over Niagara Falls in a barrel, and the stunt had made her world famous. For Charles, stuck in poverty had mouths to feed. It was hard not to notice. If one could do it, then maybe he could do it as well. That in itself could be enough to make headlines and hopefully change his life. But just as he was still toying with the idea, 2 years later in 1911, a well-known daredevil named Bobby Leach beat him to it, becoming the first man to survive the plunge in a barrel. That could have been the end of it. But Charles wasn't ready to let go. He didn't have many options, and the dream of escaping poverty through one big, show-stopping stunt kept him going. As the 1920s drew closer, nearly 11 years after first thinking it through, Charles finally had a plan in motion. Scraping together around 20 pounds, he managed to have a barrel built out of Russian oak. It was a tight fit inside, just enough room for him, and he'd even installed arm straps to keep himself locked in place. To stop the barrel from spinning or flipping mid-fall, he placed a massive anvil inside, figuring it would act as a counterweight, keeping the barrel upright and steady through the drop. On paper, it looked alright, but the problem was he hadn't actually tested any of it. No dry runs, no trial drops. Just like every other stunt he'd pulled before, he was relying on instinct and imagination. As word spread that Charles was planning to take on the falls, Bobby Leach and a bunch of other daredevils reached out, warning him not to go through with it unless he had tested the barrel first. But testing it would mean sending it over empty, and Charles didn't want to risk wrecking the barrel he could barely afford to build in the first place. Plus, he started thinking Bobby was just being jealous and didn't want him to break the same record he once held. So even after all the back and forth from Bobby and a bunch of others, he just shrugged it off and never bothered to test his barrel or even double check if it was actually built to survive something that risky. The only safety measures he had were the arm straps, padded clothes to soften the blow a little, and a small oxygen tank, which he only took because his friends and family basically begged him to. Finally, around 8:15 in the morning of July 11th, 1920, Charles was standing nearly 5 kilometers upstream from the Horseshoe Falls, in front of thousands of spectators, getting ready to climb into his barrel. He had already placed the anvil inside, got in himself, strapped in using the arm straps, and was almost ready to be pushed over when he suddenly noticed something was off. The anvil, which was basically a hunk of metal, wasn't strapped down to anything. During the fall, it could roll, shift, even hit him inside the barrel or throw it off balance. So in a last-minute attempt to fix the problem, Charles made a pretty reckless call. Instead of tying the anvil down with the barrel or figuring out a safer way, he just strapped the thing to his own feet. One of the many concerns Bobby Leach and others had about the stunt was that the anvil was far too heavy. There was a real risk that it would cause the barrel to drop too fast, hit too hard, and drastically reduce any chance of survival. And now, with it strapped to his own legs, the problem wasn't just a rapid fall. There was a serious chance the anvil would drag the barrel underwater and take Charles down with it. But Charles, of course, was either too confident or too desperate to think about all that. While Bobby and the others had shown up to watch the stunt, just minutes before Charles' fatal plunge, the group quietly walked away due to being too nervous to witness what they feared was about to happen. At about 8:55 a.m., after getting fully strapped in and padded up, Charles' barrel was pushed towards the falls. As expected, it dropped at horrifying speeds, crashed hard onto the rocky, chaotic water below, and instantly shattered into pieces. With the anvil attached to his feet, Charles was yanked down into the river, but because his arms were still strapped to the inside of the barrel, the force of the anvil tore the rest of his body away, leaving one of his tattooed arms still tied in place. After an intense search, only the arm and a few broken barrel fragments were ever found. The rest of his remains were never found. Charles became the first person to die attempting a barrel stunt at Niagara Falls, ultimately getting the fame he had been chasing, though his family likely remained stuck in the same poverty cycle he was trying so hard to escape. In 2017, a video from northern Thailand made quite a wave online, showing a psychic or spiritualistic performing what's said to be a ritual meant to honor the spirits of their ancestors. In the footage, the 25-year-old man named Thiprit Bali, dressed in traditional attire, is seen dancing with a large knife in hand while a circle of intrigued onlookers watch closely. But just moments later, the whole thing took a dark turn when he suddenly stabbed himself in the chest, right in front of the horrified crowd, and bled to death on the spot. As unsettling as that was, what made it even more shocking was why he did it. Thiprit had claimed he was some kind of immortal superhuman, and the act was meant to prove exactly that. Not only that, this wasn't the first time he'd done it. In the same area, he was pretty well known for it. People actually believed he couldn't die, and he was a beloved fortune teller. Every year during a traditional celebration, he'd gather a massive crowd, with people coming from all over the town and nearby villages to get their fortunes told and to witness him perform the same death-defying act. The show would begin with him stepping out in front of everyone, performing a ritualistic dance, and then pulling out a huge, terrifying-looking blade. He'd then push it into his chest, only for the blade to snap in half without harming him. That was the moment the crowd would go wild, cheering, celebrating, tossing gifts, and of course, handing over a ton of money. The trick obviously was in the blade. It looked legit, but it was actually a rigged prop designed to break under pressure. For years, Thiprit managed to pull it off, fooling the people of Chiang Mai, and was even starting to go viral online. That is, until April 25th of 2017, when everything went horribly wrong. As Thiprit drove the blade into his chest, the fake weapon malfunctioned. Instead of snapping, it punctured him clean through, and he started bleeding badly. At first, the crowd stayed in place, assuming it was part of the act, like always, but then he dropped to the ground, screaming in pain and bleeding heavily. That's when the panic set in. People rushed to him, trying to help, and emergency services were called right away, but the wound was too deep, straight through the center of his chest, and the bleeding just wouldn't stop. Not long after, Thiprit was pronounced dead and mortal at the same time.